Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of tariffs, and particularly tariffs in the context of replacing income tax. So if we sort of divide the two things, that you've got the option when if you're a government trying to raise revenue, you can tax earnings or you can tax consumption. Now you can do that through like an across-the-board consumption tax, or you put a tariff on imports, which again is a sort of a consumption tax, because if consumers want to buy the buy the imported product, then built within the price of that product will be the tariff, which is an amount paid by the exporter, or if you like, a combo between the exporter and the importer, but paid by the exporter to have access to, in this case, the US market and the US consumer. If we look at the different taxing earnings and having an internal revenue service that is not bound by the same laws that you and I, if a private firm tries to come after you in the way that the Internal Revenue Service or Taxation Office, call it what you like, does, then they'd be in serious trouble. But the latitude and the default position that the IRS has is they're always in the right, and they have sweeping arbitrary powers to take your properties, sweep your bank accounts and this sort of thing. And in a supposedly free society and private citizens, and you own private ownership of wealth, these sorts of things, then does the Internal Revenue Service have a place when it has those sort of draconian, arbitrary, unilateral powers? Now, on the other side, their task is to collect revenue to pay for government services. Nobody really wants to pay very few want to pay the income tax willingly. Therefore, do they need these powers to force people, coerce people to pay up? Now, another thing about income tax that I've always had I guess a philosophical problem with is I don't get a choice. I have to pay that tax, and if I want any sort of work or any sort of income rather, I have to pay that tax, and I don't get a choice in the matter. Now you can say, well, it is your choice. You can choose not to work, for example. Well, I guess, but the material point is here. What I need an income, I need work, therefore I have to pay a tax, and it's not my choice to pay it necessarily, or at that rate. On the other side of it, I don't get a choice about how that money is spent. Given US aid and all the DEI programs, I never agreed to any of those. Given all the money spent on bringing in illegal aliens, all these illiterate third world peasants, and so I didn't get a choice in that. No one asked my vote or opinion or anything on that, so I don't get a choice of how the money is spent. Now, if there is no income tax, and all the money that is earned, I get to keep, but I have to pay consumption taxes and tariffs, that sort of thing. And let's sort of use tariffs just in isolation, assuming that's going to be what primarily, if not absolutely, replaces income tax, if that's abolished. Then I get a choice over what I spend it on. Now, if it's discretionary items, then I've got a choice. I can choose not to buy a new iPhone every year. I can choose not to upgrade to the latest, Xbox, or Sony PlayStation. I can choose not to upgrade to the new one every year. I can choose not to buy every new game that comes out, or so I get a choice. So to get if I look on the shelf at the grocery store, there's the imported mustard or anything imported food stuff, or the local foods. I can choose not to buy the imported one and thus not pay the tariff. So I get a choice of where and what I spend my money on. I can buy a second-hand item, for example, instead of a new one for whatever reason. If I want to buy, got a new bicycle not long ago, and there was a perfectly good one that I could buy on like a neighbour, some dude down the road, and I didn't have to buy new. So again, that's my choice. So the idea is when you've got a tariff on consumption or any consumption tax, you get a choice of where you spend your money. Do you buy new stuff all the time? Now, some of the complaints about the tariff on say iPhones or something like that, or the latest in electronics or maybe motor vehicles or something like that, is if you're the sort of person that has to buy the latest every year, then, and you're already paying a lot anyway, then you would have to pay a larger amount of money because the tariffs would be higher on those goods, the iPhone as an example, or other stuff. So therefore, you would be in a less advantageous position. But remember, you don't have to buy a new iPhone so the choice to buy a new iPhone every year is yours. You can choose to buy one every second year, in which case the tariff imposition that you're so worried about would be the same as previously, because you're only buying once. You can buy once. I mean, my phone I've got here, I mean, it must be 3 years old now, maybe even older. I'm not someone who goes out and buys new iPhones or the latest. I don't particularly care about that. But the point I'm making here is you get a choice over where you spend your money. Now, how the tariffs would fall and whether or not state governments or regional governments would decide to jack up the consumption tax or sales tax or goods tax, whatever it is. Would the tariffs cover it? What if the spending patterns of people changed? And what if those tariffed goods were replaced by locally manufactured US goods? Then the government would collect less money from tariffs. So would they then switch the taxation, because they still need the tax revenue, would they switch the taxation revenue emphasis to, say, corporate tax? How would that then play out? Would locally made goods become artificially expensive so when you're changing the tax base, it's if there is a problem, there's no point and nothing's to be gained by moving the problem around. If the problem sort of on the left side or the right side of the fence or the up or the, doesn't matter, the problem's still there, you just moved it, but the problem remains. Now, the core issue is that the government needs revenue. How does it achieve that? Now, tariffs are great. So, okay, well, that replaces, let's say tariffs are put, abroad and income tax is abolished, then there's a lot of incentive now for American firms to manufacture locally, to produce, get a bigger share of the market, produce goods at a better price or whatever the case may be. So then the government loses revenue from the tariffs and say, hey, we're not making as much money. We budgeted to get $2 gazillion a year from tariffs, but all the manufacturing is going local now. So there's not the imports coming in from overseas. So we can't. So the tariff revenue is falling through the floor. How are we going to make up that difference? So again, the options are corporate tax or consumption tax. And if the consumption tax goes to a certain point, then, and that's on all goods, whether it be locally manufactured or not, then what was the benefit of switching to a tariff or going tariff and abolishing income tax and these sorts of things? So the tax mix would be evolving and changing to adapt to the changing pattern of consumption, which would in turn drive the changing amount or the variable amount of tax collected. Governments can budget not perfectly, but pretty closely the next year, because they're taxing income. The next year we're going to collect X amount of dollars in tax revenue. But when it's tariffs that is making up the bulk of the revenue collection, then that creates a variable factor that can only be made up by a consumption tax, or which would then be a tax on everything, not just imports, and or a corporate tax mix. So the discretion factor would then be reduced for the consumer, because now there's a higher consumption tax on everything, therefore their discretion has changed, or they've lost a large amount of discretion. They can't say, well, I just won't buy the imported item, and that will allow me to keep more of my money or use my money more efficiently. When the consumption tax is broad-based and everything, then the discretion factor again is reduced. So the consumer no longer has discretion because they've got to pay the consumption tax on everything no matter what. Now, there's still discretionary factors there that someone is getting to keep all their income because they're now not paying income tax. So should the consumption tax fall on essentials of life? So should the consumption tax be on things like on, say, milk, bread, and fresh fruit and vegetables, these sorts of things? Because those are things you sort of have to have. That there's a certain baseline of things you have to have. Should there be a consumption tax on rent, or should there be consumption tax on things that aren't discretionary? For example, there are very high taxes on alcohol and cigarettes in Australia and other countries too. Now, I don't smoke, neither does my wife, and we don't drink that much. So that the high taxes and that don't really affect us. We're not really bothered by it. But for people that are heavy drinkers or smokers, then it would bother them. But they've still got discretion to stop doing that. But if there's heavy consumption taxes on things like bread and milk, you don't really have the discretion there. You kind of got to eat. And if it's baseline staples such as bread and milk, then should a consumption tax fall on that? Because people can't not buy it. So the mix would take a while. Once you change one key pillar of an economic system, abolishing income tax, the switching to tariffs and consumption tax combos, then the whole system will take a while to play out in terms of where the cards fall, and that would create a period of uncertainty for that. So if you get to keep all your income, but you got to pay $50 for a loaf of bread, then what have you gained? I mean, not very much. If anything, you might even have lost in the overall scheme of things. So, and the revenue rate will be highly variable if it's based on tariffs, particularly given there'll be import replacement manufacturing and production and offering of services in the United States, which would avoid the tariff. So you lose income on tariffs, then you got to make it up some other way, and that would be how the evolution of the system would play out. It would certainly be a new road. The idea of the consumer having discretion on what they spend their money on, and not have it effectively, stolen from them and then spent arbitrarily at the discretion of an administrative class that treat the worker, the consumer, the voter with utter contempt, then that would be a pleasant change. But the power going back to the consumer would be viewed as intolerable by the administrative class, the World Economic Forum class, the United Nations goons, the Klaus Schwabs, all this sort of thing. It'd be intolerable that the consumer would have choice there, so that they would then move to put a heavy consumption tax on the staples of life in order to recover the power of the administrative state. So again, there are these things that would play out over time also. So if we're going to abolish income tax, it would be my view, then we also have to reinstitute absolute accountability of the politicians to the people. And that's been lost, since the mid to late 1990s. The globalists began to move in and take total control of all Western governments, the United States as well, and democracy, to whatever extent it did exist, hasn't existed since. The vote of the citizen has been regarded as an annoyance and an irritation. We don't have to share power with you anymore. We don't have to curry favour with getting your vote. We can. Our masters are now the World Economic Forum, so we have a very safe, stable administrative world where we just order and issue edicts and that's it. And you don't matter anymore. So if income taxes be abolished, that will give one side of the equation back to the citizen keeping their income. But the other side has to be that the accountability of the politician to the people must also be there, and must also be put in place and kept in place. And this is the two. Only the two together will make it work. If it's one, if it's just the abolishing income tax, then the administrative state will find a way of clawing back their power through, again, consumption taxes on staples and those sorts of things. You've been Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.